You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Homefield Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio, Scott Caulfield joining you. It is the 8th of December, and a day we will remember in the history of Indiana football as the Hoosiers are in the first ever 12-team college football playoff. It's official. They announced the bracket. Scott, they can't take this one away from us. Indiana in the 7-10 matchup. They're going to be traveling to South Bend to take on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish on Friday, December 20th at 8 p.m. under the lights. I got a lot of thoughts. We got a lot of things to talk about. Scott, first of all, the way this season has gone, how are you feeling right now, sitting here on Sunday, knowing that IU's in the college football playoff?
Dude, we're doing a podcast that's probably going to be titled College Football Playoff Reveal, and we have an hour. Like, we're doing a college football playoff podcast about Indiana football. Hard stop. This is awesome. Like, outside of like we were going to get the game day crew to come on our podcast. Like, I'm not sure what else the next height is. This is unbelievable. We're in. Yeah, they can't take it away. Although I'm sure Paul Feinbaum's still calling up AP voters. Like, dude, LSU had a pretty good year. Like, are we sure we don't want to talk about them?
No, it's we'll talk a little bit later about ESPN's show, which somehow they treated like a funeral for the first 20 minutes because you could tell that they knew that Alabama wasn't getting in. But that's not what we're going to focus on here to start with.
I wanted to watch the non-SEC version. I didn't know if there was like a Manning cast of just like normal version of that show.
But no, Indiana in the college football playoff. And before we get to talking specifically about that, just to note, folks, that we are, of course, part of the Back Home Network. And the Back Home Network, of course, is brought to you by Homefield Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. And as we've talked about many times, Scott, Homefield is always on the ball. They announced right as the announcement came out that Indiana was in the playoff. Here we have the complete Indiana collection. You have the Indiana College Football Playoff hoodie. You're in red. You have one in black with the college football logo and marks and whatnot. You've got some joggers. You've got some long sleeve T-shirts and a retro crew. Looks like Indiana made the playoff in 1991 there. And I believe if I'm correct, it's 20% off right now if your team's in the playoff, which of course Indiana is. But go over to Homefield Apparel, buy some merch. You're going to want to wear it if you're going up to the game here in a couple of weeks. Indiana playing Notre Dame. Go over to Homefield Apparel. Get yourself outfitted. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're looking forward to it. So, Scott, let's just start with overall the initial thoughts here on this matchup between Indiana and Notre Dame. For a long time, we thought, Indiana's going to have to play at Georgia. Well, then Georgia won last night. Or it's like, well, they got to go to State College, or they're going to have to go back to Columbus, or they got to go to Neyland. This was a game I don't think people entirely thought could happen because Notre Dame looked like they were going to be higher in the rankings, and Indiana was not going to be able to get to a spot where the seeding worked out. Well, here it does. And a lot of people have looked at this particular matchup and been like, wow, if Indiana could somehow draw Notre Dame's a very good team, but a lot of the concerns that you have, the insane crowds at places like State College or Neyland, or even just like amazing metrics in terms of what you've done all season. Notre Dame has certainly been impressive in spots, but they have the loss to Northern Illinois earlier this year. This feels like a matchup that's pretty ideal for Indiana, all things considered, not taking anything away from Notre Dame, but this is absolutely the kind of matchup that you would like to see if you're Indiana compared to some of the other options.
Yeah, I think everything on Saturday broke well for Indiana. We were not in a spot where we were going to get a home game. That was really off the table. So it kind of became, where's your best path to play a team in the first round on the road? Thank you to Syracuse for knocking Miami out, which really got us off the bubble. So there you go.
Actually, yes.
Thank you, Matt. Talk about the sweatshirt I'm wearing. I will say that I did, after listening to Galen's pod, the Bison chat, who we should root for. I did a who you should root for parlay bet of Boise State, Georgia. My thought being Georgia and Texas flipping, Oregon and Clemson, which won nicely. So thank you, Galen, for helping me win a little cash, which we'll need to spend in 2 weeks on.
Right. All those gambling winnings you've made the last 2 years, folks, they're going towards tickets. I just wanted to let you know that.
Yeah. No, this So everything coalesced. I was, as you started looking at the teams that we were in the realm of playing, whether it was Georgia or Texas, Tennessee, I still felt, and I think this played in, nobody's talked about it. I don't think the Big Ten was ever going to have two teams playing in the first round if they could avoid it, because you want, as you would say, you want tonnage in the second round. You want to get as many teams in. So you don't want Indiana playing Penn State and automatically knocking one of your teams out. But didn't really want to play at Penn State or Ohio State. As you look at the possible options there, Notre Dame kind of stuck out as like, wow, that's, as you said, all of these teams are good. This is a team that I'm very comfortable with us playing against. And then the travel factor is like, this is a game where, ticket prices will be high, but this is a game for Indiana fans to go to. It's relatively easy for them to come in, versus if you were talking about having to play in Texas or Penn State, those are tougher places to go. And so there's a world where, this could probably be the best number of fans you're going to get in a road stadium. And also just, that stadium is big. It's good. It's not as crazy as like Penn State or Georgia or some, Tennessee, some of the SEC schools. And you saw what, our team had some issues when they played Ohio State. So for me, it's the ultimate dream first round scenario. It does kind of suck seeing Georgia sitting there in the second round. I think it would be a tough game, but at some point they're all going to be tough games, and we can't all be Penn State or Texas who just gets to cakewalk to the semifinals.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think when you get into these conversations about who you're playing, you can't talk through it without people thinking you're disrespecting the other team. And Notre Dame's an interesting case. And, I think from Indiana's perspective, one of the big things you hit on, and certainly if you look at the way Indiana's season has gone so far, the one game they had a lot of trouble in was that Ohio State game. And a lot of that was the crowd noise and the overall environment. That was just not something that this particular Indiana team had experienced. Notre Dame Stadium only seats 77,000 fans compared to the nearly 110,000 fans that you get at Ohio Stadium, at Beaver Stadium, at Neyland Stadium. So you've got that aspect. You've also got, and Notre Dame fans are, they're a lot like Michigan fans in terms of like the atmosphere is a little more sedate sometimes than you get at some of the places where it really gets nuts. And again, that's not intended to be a criticism. It's just kind of a reality. It's more of like a North Carolina basketball crowd than a Purdue basketball crowd, to use an analogy from a different sport. And then you look at Notre Dame itself. Now, Taylor Lehman over the weekend at Bite Size Bison had some really interesting thoughts overall as far as like who the best teams would be for Indiana to play. And he had Notre Dame as the second most ideal team for Indiana to play. And I want to show the statistical breakdown right here that Taylor put together. And you can see what's interesting about Notre Dame, first of all, is like Notre Dame's strength has been their defense in terms of overall performance. Indiana's strength's been their offense. But Indiana's strength in the running game is really interesting when you look at where Notre Dame has struggled against the run. Indiana's defense has been better as the season's gone by, and Notre Dame's offense has just been okay, relatively speaking, to the other teams in the playoff. You look at the numbers, you look at the overall breakdown, you look at the fact that from a strength of schedule perspective, these two teams are actually pretty similar. And you start to think to yourself, well, gosh, if you're Indiana, this is one of those situations where you look at it, you're like, this is the kind of matchup where yes, there's a talent deficit because it's Notre Dame versus Indiana, but from an executional perspective, from the way the teams have played, it's not like people thought of the Georgia game would be, right, where it's like Georgia's way the hell over there in terms of their overall talent and Indiana's here. And you've also got the reality that Notre Dame just hasn't quite had the same schedule as a lot of the SEC teams have had. And so while they have certainly accomplished quite a bit this year, I don't know that you look at Notre Dame and you say to yourself, wow, that's a hyper frightening team. When you go back and look at like the games that they've won, and they've been impressive, but their schedule so far on the season, they won at Texas A&M, lost to Northern Illinois, and then the rest of their games were Purdue, Miami of Ohio, Louisville, Stanford, Navy, who has turned out to not be very good, Florida State, Virginia, Army, and USC, who they only beat by 14 on the road. So these are things that when you think about how all this syncs up for Indiana and what to think about going into the playoff, this is why I like this matchup for Indiana. Not saying Indiana's going to win necessarily, but I do think that they've got as good of a chance in this environment against that team of any of the matchups that they could have possibly drawn in this process.
I would agree with all that. And as when I was looking at the rankings the last couple of weeks, Notre Dame was the team that always stuck out to me. And it's like, the profiles between Indiana and Notre Dame are very similar. I mean, their strength of schedule ended up being 58, ours is 68. Yes, that's 10 spots higher, but it's not, 30 or 40 spots higher. They're both very, very similar. And their one loss is just so much more glaringly bad than our one loss as well. And yeah, their win at Texas A&M probably trumps any win that we have, but the rest of them all look relatively similar. And again, I will go back to at some point, they did lose a game and they lost at Northern Illinois and they did it at home. Yeah. So, I mean, that has to matter that when they've struggled and lost. The only time that Indiana has struggled and lost is on the road to, at the time, the top, number 2-3 team in the country. So I agree with you. And again, I think there's, less travel. It's a pretty easy travel, not only for fans, but for the team. You can, they can stay in Bloomington and really make this a business trip where they just go up Friday morning, kick some ass and come back. And the other thing too, that this goes to, I think, really any other road environment that we would have, but I like that's the Angelo Pizzo. I like that a lot. I do think that this is where having that Ohio State game in the bag, where it's like, all right, we've played a very top-notch opponent. We had some issues with the crowd, with the noise. You kind of got that behind you, and now you know what you need to do to not have that happen again. And again, I go back to the Ohio State game. There's 5 or 6 miscues, which happened, and they did happen, but you take 5 or 6 miscues away, that's a much different game. And for a lot of, there are big portions of that game in the beginning and in the middle, near the end, where, we were pushing Ohio State around and we were doing what we wanted to do. It was just a couple of plays that kind of steered the tide. So all of that said, I'm with you. I think of the matchups, this is the best. And like you said, you're not knocking the other opponent. Like I've been telling people, it's like, look, these are all good teams. Like, I'm not saying Indiana can go beat any of them, but we're going to have to pick somebody to play. And I'd much rather play at Notre Dame than ever play at Tennessee or, go to Ohio State again. I think Notre Dame is the best chance for us to win.
Yeah. I mean, and so when you think about Indiana being in this spot, I think you brought up a lot of good points. I thought it was brought up as well in the chat. I mean, ultimately, it does help you to have these games ahead of time, like the one against Ohio State or the Michigan game. You feel that pressure. So much of what has made Indiana great this year has been their execution and their efficiency. And that has been disrupted, I think, a couple of times now. Indiana's going to have some time to figure out, all right, how do we fix that? Right. And the nice thing is you're going to get not 2 full weeks. You're only going to get about 12 days really to get all this prepped. But now you know who you're playing. You're the first game. And to some degree, I think that's almost a good thing because you're going to be able to lead this off. No one's really going to know how it feels. And I think ultimately you got a little bit of an advantage if you're Indiana in that you could make an argument that you've played in a bigger environment more recently than Notre Dame has in terms of a game. Yes, Notre Dame needed to win that game at USC, but I mean, what's the big game environment Notre Dame's been in this year? Is it the game they played at Kyle Field?
It's probably A&M. Yeah. I mean, they beat Army, but that was in Yankee Stadium. That's a weird environment. I mean, that's the biggest crowd they played against. Yeah.
It's so, again, for Indiana, so much of it comes down to a couple of things that they have to take care of. And we've looked at these things and what was so heartening about the Purdue game was the way that they tried to address some of them. Mm-hmm. They've got to learn to get off to a good offensive start. They've got to be able to take advantage of the running game because that really is, in looking at the numbers, that's where Notre Dame has struggled. You're probably not going to be having a lot of really explosive plays because Notre Dame's pretty good at that, and Indiana's really started to struggle with that. But overall, when I look at this, it's like, can Indiana's defense go in and win the battle in the trenches versus Notre Dame? To me, when I look at the numbers, that's one of the most intriguing things that I see is Indiana's defense and how good they've been, how good they were against the run against Michigan, how good they were against the run against Ohio State. Can they do the same thing against Notre Dame? Can they make a situation where Riley Leonard is the one that's having to beat them? Riley Leonard on the season has a pretty good, he's been okay, 2,000 yards, Jeremiah Love with 949 yards and 15 touchdowns. So I'm really curious to see, like, what do Brian Haynes and the defense do? How do they choose to attack Notre Dame? And what exactly do we see after that in terms of Indiana's offensive approach? So, it's a different type of team than we've played before. It's a quarterback that's pretty mobile. If you look at, and again, I'm going to go back, and everybody should go to Bite Size Bison and read this, but basically Taylor's summary was, if you look at what Notre Dame has done, they're very good in EPA per play defensively, but the lot of the teams that they've played have been real bad offensively. And you go back at, through that list of teams that I just mentioned, a lot like Purdue, who we know about, Navy, Florida State, Virginia. It almost feels like their numbers have been the result of kind of eating a lot of empty calories, at least defensively. Now, you could kind of make the same argument against Indiana offensively, but Indiana, I think, has played better defenses than Notre Dame has. So I'm really curious how all that plays out. And I'm also going back to what Taylor said in his written setup here, the idea that Indiana is going to have to adjust to being able to defend the run in multiple phases, because that's really what Riley Leonard helps to bring to the table along with their running backs. Like, you look at what Notre Dame has done so far this season in their rushing attack. Jeremiah Love with 949 yards and 15 touchdowns. Riley Leonard, their quarterback, with 721 yards and 14 touchdowns. And then they've got Jadarian Price, who's been very good off the bench, with 651 yards and 7 touchdowns. That feels like where a lot of Notre Dame's juice is going to come from in this one. Leonard on the season just barely over 2,000 yards, 16 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. They've certainly been able, when they've needed to do some things in the air. But again, Indiana and Curt Cignetti and this staff are really good at these types of preparations. It'll be a really fascinating thing, and a game where, frankly, Indiana doesn't have a lot of pressure on it, given that it's a home game for Notre Dame in the playoff. There's going to be an expectation that they are going to be able to go in and take care of an Indiana team that, through the different faculties of the press, has kind of been largely taken lightly, I would say, by pretty much everybody in college football the last few weeks.
So I want to look at the game this way. I want to look at a comparison of Notre Dame and Ohio State. And I'm not saying they're the same, but our premier matchup on a road environment was at Ohio State. And like we said, you ended up losing by 23 points. It wasn't awesome, but I'm going to look at it from the Indiana offense point of view, because I think we both, that was one of the lowest outputs Ohio State has had offensively. Our defense held its own. A lot of the points were due to special teams miscues that gave really short fields to Ohio State. When you look at the two teams, Ohio State is their opponents are averaging 10.9 points a game. Notre Dame is 13.6. That's a relatively wide margin. Where things get wider, when you look at rushing attempts, yards per play, Ohio State's giving up 2.8 for the season. Notre Dame's giving up 3.7. That's a very wide variance. And that's something I think is very important for Indiana, because so much of the offense is built on getting it to Justice Ellison first down in the RPO and not breaking a 50-yard run, but just instead of being 2nd and 9 or 2nd and 10, you're now going to be 2nd and 7 or 2nd and 6. And so many of those plays against Ohio State on the running side didn't get the couple of yards to kind of keep things moving. But you look at just the yardage itself. Ohio State's given up 1,162 yards on the ground. Notre Dame's given up 1,600 yards on the ground to maybe what I would say lesser teams. Ohio State has given up, 4 touchdowns this year passing. Notre Dame has given up 9 touchdowns this year passing. So they've given up more touchdowns. Even the yards per play is not as stark, but Ohio State's 4.1, Notre Dame is 4.53. So the thing that I would say for Indiana fans is these aren't really, Ohio State and Notre Dame really aren't in the same phylum. So if you're looking at it, it's like, man, the one time Indiana went on a tough road environment, they had a really hard time. Yes, that's true. But as you said, Notre Dame Stadium is not Ohio State Stadium. You have about 30,000 fans that are out on that, just 30,000 less capacity. And I would say that while Notre Dame is a good team, they're not Ohio State. And their defense has not shown to have the numbers like Ohio State. So I would venture to say that Indiana's offense should be able to look a little better, keep moving the ball. And not to mention, no matter who you're going to play, you have 2.5 more weeks of Curtis Rourke's thumb being even more closer to 100% or closer to whatever high percentage he's going to have than he was 3 weeks ago.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I think Notre Dame is going to be an interesting team to try to parse, because if you look at FPI, if you look at the efficiency section, Notre Dame actually right now is rated as the number one team in terms of overall efficiency. And that's not what a lot of people thought. Most of that efficiency is coming out of their defense. And the question becomes, well, is Notre Dame's defense, is the efficiency there because they played bad teams and just done really well? Or is it because they are legitimately a great defense? I don't think anybody's going to know the answer to that until we actually start to play. But I also think a lot of it for Indiana is going to be, if you look at where Indiana has struggled offensively this season, it has been when they haven't been able to get the short passing game going, where they've had drops or where they've had situations where people have impacted them on routes. And that has led to drives stalling. It's led to the running game not working as well. So I am really curious to see what Mike Shanahan and the offensive staff derive out of what they experienced in those Michigan and Ohio State games and how they apply it here. But ultimately, it's a good problem to have, because, again, you have the talent, you have the pieces. It's really about, can you maintain a pocket for Curtis Rourke? Taylor's been texting me while we've been doing this podcast, and Pro Football Focus grades Notre Dame 23rd in pass rush. They're 37th in the country in sacks. That's good. That's certainly upper third, but that is not necessarily the terrifying mix of what they dealt with Ohio State or even with Michigan, and certainly what they might have dealt with a Georgia. So yeah, just a lot of really interesting things to look at there. And even someone mentioned, Matt noted Purdue is so putrid, we have no measurables as a common opponent. Like, Indiana beat Purdue 66-0. Notre Dame beat Purdue 66-7.
Right.
So it is going to be interesting, because there's not a lot of common data points to look at across these two teams. I do think Indiana, it's funny because someone noted earlier on in the comments that we need to bleed the clock. I would actually argue, like, this is the kind of game where, if you're Indiana, it's really about limiting turnovers, but it's about capitalizing on possessions. If you can put a lot of points on the board, you may need to, because Notre Dame has certainly shown an affinity and an ability to do that. So how well can your defense clamp down on what they are doing? It's really going to be an interesting combination of things.
Well, and also with Alabama, it's probably a stupid comment, but with Alabama being out, if Saban's got a little extra time, him and Cignetti are friends, former coaching staffs. It's like Saban knows how to prepare for games like this. And now that he's done with his time on ESPN, honking for the SEC, maybe him and Cignetti can come together and put together a game plan, together on this. Joking, of course. But I again, this is where I believed it in the Ohio State game, and I believe it again here. I think we have the coaching advantage when you look at a 2-week lead up to this game. Cignetti has shown an ability game in and game out to come up with really good game plans for the teams that he's playing. And yeah, they're not all blowouts, and it's so funny, the standard. It's like, well, you only won by, you only beat Michigan by 6. Like, that sucks. Like, you don't win every game by 30. Like, that's just not the way it works. Like, sometimes you win close games, but the key is you're still winning. And we're still running the same basic RPO package, but the way that it gets modified is different for every single game, and it's different for each opponent. And you've seen Cignetti do that very masterfully throughout this entire season, minus, one game where, again, it was a lot of just a couple of miscues here and there. So I think we have a advantage with Cignetti having the time to prepare for this as well.
Yeah, I know. It's going to be fascinating all the way around. And I think maybe we pull back a little bit and talk more about just the overall meaning behind all of this. This is really special. This is one of those situations where we can talk about the matchup, and we'll have a lot more talk about matchup wise, but to see Indiana in the playoff, and I'll be honest, like, even the matchup itself is like super cool. Like, this is when everybody makes jokes about reversible jacket fans in the IU fan base, like, this is who they're making fun of.
Yeah.
This whole thing just is really fascinating to me, and it means so much to Indiana as a football program, to the athletic department. This is going to be the marquee game that opens up the college football playoff. Like, all of the hype is going to start with Indiana, this upstart, playing against Notre Dame I mean, it is really going like the level. We talk a lot this season about the level of promotion that you get in free marketing and free advertising that you get out of being good at football. This is now going to be 2 weeks of hype with Indiana and Notre Dame, those two brands being associated with each other and with the college football playoff. I mean, it's so surreal. And we've heard people in the comments talking about this. We've heard people talking on Twitter about this. It is so surreal that this is the spot that Indiana's in right now. And it's certainly nothing we could have predicted a year ago when we were still trying to figure out who was going to be on the roster with Curt Cignetti and his staff coming in.
And just an if, we've been playing Fever Dream all year. If you win this game, what's also really cool is you basically become the promotion for the entire day of Saturday.
Right.
You're the one win. So it's like when they go to halftime of that first game, they're probably going to Cignetti to talk about like, hey, how was that win? You know, like in the NCAA tournament, the teams that win Thursday are kind of talked about all day Friday. You kind of become the story. That will happen if Indiana wins this game. It kind of becomes the, oh my God, like where this is actually happening. They're real. You know, maybe people will read suddenly the Ohio State game will be relitigated differently. This is beyond any expectation any of us had and any fan had going into this year. The idea that we were there, not only just that we're in the college football playoff, that we legitimately earned the spot, and that for every single ranking show, Indiana has been a part of it. Yep. It's not something where we backed in or, you know, and I know it's not the perfect example, like one of those years, 7-10 years ago where, Ohio State and Penn State were both ineligible. And like, so we were leading the Big Ten East because we were like 4-5. Like, we didn't back into it that way or somehow back into a Big Ten title. We legitimately were on the show, the selection show, every single week. And we were always there. And it's unbelievable. And it's so cool to see the logo. It's so cool to see us being talked about. It's fun for a while there where it did feel like we were breaking modern college football, where it's just having Indiana here just feels so wrong. And how can we be doing this? But as an Indiana fan, this is unbelievable. It's something, you're not going to be able to take away.
Right.
It's one of those where like you were in, I would always joke about that year in like 2002 or 3 where Illinois made a Sugar Bowl. And it's like they were in a New Year's Six Bowl. People hear me talk about my buddy Robert all the time, but he loves the fact that they, Michigan State that one year won the Big Ten and they were in the, college football playoff at that time, the 4-game playoff. We're there. We did it. And, for all eternity, it's like, all right, teams that, made the college football playoff, we are one of them. And that's really unbelievable. It's awesome. And I'm like you, I'm not quite sure I fully know how to put it into words and how important this is for our program to be there. And to wrap it up, like you said, the Notre Dame thing is just a really cool matchup. The other ones that were there, it would have been very cool, but playing another Big Ten team would have been like, well, shoot, man, we play Penn State, we play Ohio. Like, there's nothing, it's different because it's a game. And if we had played like Georgia or, Tennessee, it would have been cool there too. Cause it's like, all right, we're playing one of the big boys. This is us kind of going into the big boy room of college football. There is something really cool because there is a lot of connection Indiana, Notre Dame. We just signed the deal to play them in 27 and 28.
No, it's actually 30 and 31.
32. Okay.
So we're just starting the series way early, I guess. Here.
I remember playing them in the 90s. But it's like you said, it's a state rivalry. You're going to see the graphic, I'm sure, 120 miles apart. But there has been a lot of bleed over between these two fan bases because, as you mentioned, it is the reversible fandoms. Like, I'm an Indiana basketball, Notre Dame football fan, which I think drives a lot of people crazy in Indiana who are just straight Indiana fans. But so there's more to this game that I think people nationally fully realize. And, if they win, you are beating, Georgia is good, Clemson is good, Oregon is good now. Notre Dame is the Yankees of college football. This is the gold standard. So if you win, it's going to be a legitimate big time win because you are beating one of the, when you talk about blue bloods, this is exactly what you're talking about. Notre Dame is a blue blood of college football.
Yeah. It's fascinating. It's like, it's like the nerds finally getting invited to the dance that they've never actually been able to get invited to before. You're just it's tough in a great way. Just like, you're talking about all these different teams and all of these established college football brands. And then you've got Indiana. And it's funny, like, of course, Reese Davis on the show tried to throw something in there where it's like, well, did you think about Indiana in relation to SMU, Alabama? And Ward Manuel was like, no, we're good.
Yeah.
Which was great. Yeah. But for Indiana to have been that far in.
Yeah.
We talked about this after the Michigan game and how tense that Michigan game was. And, winning that game, we said it at the time and people were like, well, maybe not. But it was like Indiana made the playoff with that win. And that ended up being what happened. And it is amazing that Indiana sustained through that Ohio State loss and had done so much and had done so well. And certainly I think that win against Purdue and the way that they responded, it left the mark on the committee that had been left throughout the course of basically the middle part of the season, which was Indiana has addressed the lack of strength of schedule by just beating the crap out of every opponent that they've played, except for a couple. And I really do think if there was going to be any dissension about Indiana being in this, a lot of it was taken care of by the fact that Michigan, the one team that they had struggled with outside of Ohio State, beat Ohio State and beat them at Ohio State. So it is amazing how fortunate this whole season has fallen for Indiana. And that's not to say that it's luck, because this isn't luck. This was a tremendous plan by Curt Cignetti. It was a tremendous plan by the athletic department to figure out how to make the stadium exciting and get people in there. That really buoyed Indiana throughout most of what they did in the second half of the season. And give the Hoosiers credit. They did what they needed to do when they needed to do it. And even this feels like a fortunate fall. Even if Indiana loses in this game, as you said, like, this is the gold standard brand. It's like Alabama, Notre Dame. That might be the top two. Like, when you think about college football, if you walk down the street and you ask somebody, you'd ask them about, they'd probably give you one of those two names. And so it is such a remarkable and amazing and exciting thing to see Indiana in this matchup. And the fact that we've got a couple of weeks to talk about it, and the fact that, it's a short drive. It's a 3-hour drive from Bloomington now to get to South Bend. It's an hour 45 from where you live to get up there.
Yeah.
So you don't even need hotel rooms necessarily if you don't want to. You
can an hour from Chicago, which has a huge IU fan base.
So, and we're seeing that. Scott, I don't know if you've delved at all into the ticket situation, but SeatGeek's right now the get-in price is $1,455. Now there'll be tickets released, and Indiana's going to have an allotment, but it's a small allotment, and this is not just an Indiana thing. Basically, the rules of the college football playoff are the college football playoff keeps all of the ticket revenue. They have a $3,500 visiting team allotment, or 3,500 ticket visiting team allotment. Sorry. And the thing is, with this matchup, you're going to have a ton of Indiana fans that are going to want to go. You're going to have a ton of Notre Dame fans that are going to want to go. It's funny. You look at the other price points right now.
I was thinking like this will be the most expensive game of all of them.
Right. So right now the get-in price for SMU Penn State is $194. The get-in price for Ohio State Tennessee is $347. The get-in price
for Ryan Day have to pay that. Are they making him pay to get in now at this point?
The get-in price for Clemson, Texas is $439, and then for Indiana and Notre Dame it's $1,424. No, it's $1,592. Now, this is going to get ugly if you didn't buy tickets immediately when the thing launched. This is going to be it's going to be a tough price point for a lot of people. And I don't say that in any glee, but it's going to make that environment even more fascinating, because these are, as much as Notre Dame and Indiana fans kind of live in the same geographical area, you could not have two fan bases, I think, less connected given their geographic proximity. It's like Notre Dame's played series with Purdue. They play series with Michigan. They play series with Michigan State. They played a series with Ohio State a couple of years ago. The last time Indiana and Notre Dame played was Trent Green was the starting quarterback for Indiana. It was 1991. I think it was actually the year that Indiana – did they miss the bowl that year? I forget. But they went up to Notre Dame. It was a one-off game. They lost 49-27, and we never saw them again. And so it is going to be a really fascinating vibe in that stadium just with those two fan bases having not really touched that much over the course of their lifespans.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it really is the most different fan bases because you have, like I said, the ultimate blue blood fan base, and Indiana's just completely, we're happy to be here. This is awesome. Since week 8, Indiana is number 1 nationally in EPA rush allowed. Thanks, Taylor. Yes. The numbers are, I'm going back to just trying to put this into perspective. I mean, this is something, it's really wild. I mean, if there was an 8-team playoff, if you get rid of some of the seeding, some of the buys and stuff, we probably would have made that also. I mean, that's how high we soared this year. It's really unbelievable. You could not have asked for a better first year. I mean, I know you've joked about this is really where you need to write a book about what happened this year, because turnarounds like this in college just don't happen. I mean, we've talked about it. You can have, I heard on Bison Chat, talking about going into this year that the hire of the offseason for the Big Ten was John Smith at Michigan State, who didn't have probably the season he wanted, but I wouldn't say it was a failure. I mean, that was, he took over a really tough program and they went 5-7. That's normally pretty good. For someone to come in Indiana and take it over, I think you and I would have been like 5-7, 6-6, probably would have been like, sign me up. Like that sounds pretty good. I think there's a little bit more meat on the bone. Maybe we can get to 7. To take a program in college from really falling apart to you're in the college football playoff is bananas.
Yeah.
But I will say this too, you've seen the way Cignetti has attacked this season, the way he attacks games. There are some coaches, even at high levels, who look at it kind of like, hey, we're happy to be here. And you see this sometimes with schools that, like, you're happy to be there in the tournament. They play kind of not to lose, and then they end up getting, they losing, and they kind of just go with the whimper. Cignetti is not wired that way. I think every time, you saw the way they played in that Michigan game, the way they played in that Nebraska game, where they had moments to make a statement, and it wasn't, we're going to just try and win this and get out of here without making a noise. He wanted to make a statement. So all that said, Cignetti understands when there's a real opportunity to take a step forward. And I think that he's aggressive in going at that. And so I'm not concerned that we're going to come out and, try and bleed the clock and try and win at 17-16 or something. I think Cignetti is going to put together a plan. It's like, if we're going to win, we're going to come in and punch you in the mouth, which to me, like, that's how teams upset. That's when you're an underdog on the road. That's how you make those upsets, is you come in, you punch a team in the mouth, you get them a little off kilter, and then you start leaning on stuff.
Yeah. Look, so much of what we've seen out of Indiana, like, this is all uncharted territory, and it's really going to be fascinating, I think, to watch Indiana process this as they go along. I'm really curious to see, when you think about Indiana and where they're going to be at mentally, the fact that they get some time to just reflect on the fact that they're there is probably good, because they can get that out of their system. They don't have to turn around and play at the end of this week. They play next week. And I think, the copious amounts of tape that would probably be watched in the course of the next few days to try to start to get the game plan together, I think Indiana's going to like the things that they see when it comes to what they've got to do. That doesn't mean that Indiana's necessarily going to be successful in doing those things, but I don't think they're going to look at this and say this is a bridge too far. So there's just a lot of cool little aspects to this that are going to be curious to keep an eye on as we go into this next couple of weeks.
I want to hit this question for Pitt Hoosier. If we win, does this count as a bowl win, even though it's not a bowl? And here's my answer. Yes. Everyone's kind of making up these rules as we go along.
Right.
Like it's like we're kind of not, no one was really 100% sure of how this, bye thing would work going into it. Yes, by all means, call it a bowl win. Yeah, it's not the, pull and weed eater bowl, but it is a college football playoff bowl game. You made the college football playoff. You damn well put up a banner or whatever, a flag in the stadium for that. And if you win a game, by all means, call it a bowl win. Who's going to stop us? Yep. Like, yes, it's not traditionally a bowl, but in my mind, yes, you won a postseason game in college football. That means something.
Yeah, it's going to be just I think a really, really cool thing. And when you get down to it, ultimately, Indiana's in a no-lose situation in a lot of ways here. If you go into South Bend and you lose the game, everybody expects that. Right. What was the opening line? I think it was Notre Dame by 8.5. What was the amount? But I think, if Indiana goes in and plays their game and remembers who they are, they've got as good of a shot in this as anybody. And that is going to be interesting to see. I'm fascinated to see what the overall projections are going to be once this game gets on the schedule and in terms of the total numbers.
Right.
So yeah, it's just cool. The whole thing is cool. And the whole thing, there's going to be a ton of time to kind of break it down and figure out how to approach this and what to think about it as we get closer to the game. I did, Scott, you wanted to talk a little bit about the show itself that ESPN did. So now incidentally, the spread is at 8 now with an over under of 51.5.
Okay.
And it looks like the matchup, they don't have the FPI matchup thing yet. So we'll keep an eye on that. But that's where things are at this point after opening at 8.5. So that's going to be interesting to see. Indiana plus 270 on the money line in this game. So any other thoughts right now that you have in terms of going into this and just kind of the overall thought process with Indiana?
No, I think we've hit most of the main things. I think this is the best team we could have played in the best environment that we could have played based on all the other factors that were there. The fact that it's a state championship game, as somebody mentioned, like that's very cool. To me, I'm ecstatic. I think this is awesome. This is exactly who I wanted to play, where I wanted to play, and I kind of like being the first game. Like you don't have to watch other games and have jitters. You can come out and set the tone, and it is so unbelievable, man. Like this season has been wild, and it's amazing that we are in this position and that, we weren't even one of the teams being talked about being on the bubble. Like
right.
You said, they tried to kind of throw us in the bubble. It's like, no, they're not going to have a graphic about it. We are solidly in. So yeah, no, it's awesome. And I really do like our chances. I think, it's going to be interesting to see how people pick this game and look through the picks. But, even if you win this, you talked about all day Saturday, there's, from then on out, it's neutral site games.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, and this
to Georgia.
And that's the thing. So the winner of this game will be playing Georgia.
Right.
And they'll be playing them in the Sugar Bowl, in whatever they call that now. It's the Superdome, but it's not the Superdome anymore.
Mercedes-Benz Dome.
Yeah, Mercedes-Benz Dome or whatever. So, that's an interesting one. The whole thing is cool, and right now I have no interest in looking at anything beyond what the first game is. But we did want to talk a little bit before we stop today about the show and the overall presentation. It's interesting, Scott, after Indiana was the primary focus of debate and controversy and reprisals against the committee for basically like a 5-week period of time.
Right.
They were largely out of the conversation over the course of the last week. And I think that's really fascinating because the conversation gradually started to focus on SMU, Alabama, and what was going to go happen down at the tail end of the pool. So it is interesting that outside of that one perfunctory question that Reese Davis asked Ward Manuel, Indiana hasn't gotten a whole lot of talk. It's just been assumed that they were going to be in. But I was really disappointed by ESPN's approach to the start of their show, where they basically spent the first 20 minutes kind of whining about what you could clearly tell was Alabama not getting in and SEC teams theoretically not getting respected, all of which is garbage. Because apparently this is the first year that we've stopped considering losses as important in college football. But it is interesting now, reflecting back on the show, what should be a celebration of college football and what should be a celebration of these teams making it into the first ever 12-team playoff, ESPN chose to just kind of, pee in the punch bowl to start things off with and frame it like, well, the committee's really, not doing a great job. It's a weird editorial decision for a company that essentially controls the process.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was funny that after they announced everything, I even texted you, it's like they had to have the 5-minute, like, let's just talk about the SEC and how great the SEC is and how important a tough schedule in the SEC is better than all the conferences, even the Big Ten. It's like, why are we talking about this? I also like kind of almost having these hostage video type discussions where Saban is like, well, if you're going to leave us out, then we're not going to, we might as well cancel all those non-conference games. It's like, okay, can we stop threatening things? Or like, well, if you leave SMU out, people are just going to stop playing conference championship games. Like, let's just have a criteria, make some choices. And some people are going to be unhappy, but I just thought it was funny that both sides of the SMU Alabama coin we're kind of playing this, I'll get it right, straw man argument of, if you let us out, what, it's what, like my kids did at 3 years old. Like, I'm going to throw a tantrum if you don't do this. Like, we will cancel all the non-conference games. Like, okay, do it. Like, I mean, honestly, the person who had the most, in my mind, measured take that made the most sense was Kirk Herbstreit when he was saying, you have these large conferences and there are very unbalanced schedules. Like the Big Ten conference schedule that Ohio State and Indiana played, or Penn State and Indiana played, are just radically different. And his point was, it's because everyone's basically making their schedule in their own little fiefdom and not really sharing. Is, the idea of how you solve this is you get everyone in a room at the beginning of the year and you try and level out all of the schedules across both non-conference and conference. But it's like, that's great. That sounds awesome. That's never going to happen. Yeah. That's not going to happen. But it is a way that would solve some of this.
It's one of those things where, as you mentioned, like, it's just a disingenuous argument. Because, for the longest time, it was, strength of schedule is the thing that matters. And that's never been, and even Saban started off by saying, well, we're not looking at strength of schedule. And it's like, we haven't historically. And it's like, well, there's a reason for that.
Right.
Because it's never been as simple as who played the best teams. There have been plenty of teams that have had a great strength of schedule, but have lost a game or 2 games that didn't get invited to whatever the BCS championship was, or didn't get invited to the 14 playoff. That's never been the metric. It only became the metric when it became inconvenient for the SEC. Right. And it had nothing to do with non-conference strength of schedule. I mean, this is the thing that has been, I think, the most frustrating. You saw all those tweets this morning about people complaining about, don't expect SEC teams to schedule anybody difficult in the non-conference. Alabama's non-conference schedule this year was Western Kentucky, South Florida, Wisconsin, and Mercer. So, like, get out of here with that is my response. Like, that is not a legitimate argument. These teams did not get left out because they lost non-conference games to tough opponents. They got left out because they lost games in the SEC to teams that weren't that good. When you lose games to 6-6 teams or worse, you don't get to complain about these things, Scott.
Yeah.
Right?
I agree. I also think of, I always think of I forget who it was, but it was somebody on the set during one of those, it wasn't Reese Davis, but whoever Fowler, I believe. Anyway, whoever was the host of the basketball tournament show, and Dick Vitale is just going off like, oh man, you got to make it. Like, that team's got to make it. Like, how are you leaving them out? St. John's, like, how you did? And like, they went to break, and he's like, hey Dick, someone's got to be out. Like, at some point, somebody has to be out. Like, we can't just. There is a number. Like, we're going for 64 teams at the time. Like, there's the 65th team. Like, it's just the way it works. Someone's out.
I remember reading somewhere somebody was trying to describe the NCAA selection process, and they're like, whatever you do, don't listen to Dick Vitale, because Dick Vitale thinks 85 teams need to get in every year. And this though, I feel like Dick Vitale does it from a sense of love.
Correct.
Whereas all these SEC hacks in the media,
and all SEC, it's just, can we get more SEC schools in?
Right. And it's just like, this is going to be something that college football does have to address, because, and here's what I mean. The problem is you have 12 games in which you are supposed to compare teams to other teams. You have these mega conferences, which are only put together for the purposes of making money. They're not put together for competitive purposes. Their schedules aren't put together for competitive purposes. And the conferences are too big for everybody to play everybody. I mean, just go down the list this year. Indiana didn't play Penn State and didn't play Oregon. Penn State didn't play Oregon until the Big Ten championship game. Alabama didn't play Texas. Tennessee didn't play Texas. And you can just kind of go down the list. SMU didn't play Miami, didn't play Clemson. Miami didn't play SMU, didn't play Clemson. You're not going to be able, in such a small sample size, to say for sure these are the best teams, therefore they get in. You can't just throw records out, because we've never done that in college football. I say we, like I've been part of the college football landscape forever. Me, having been in the club for a solid 2 months now, I got a lot of thoughts. No, but there's not a good way under the current setting to do this. And I think what it'll lead to is a pretty rapid expansion of the playoff to 16. You'll still have arguments at that point, but ultimately the prestige factor for the Big Ten and the SEC and being able to say, essentially, our top 4 teams need to be in there. And it's not an unreasonable ask. And you still need to be able to leave room for some of these other teams. But to me, it's like if you'd had a 16-team playoff, would the SEC have gotten 6 teams in this year? Would they have, or what would the number have been? Would they have put Alabama and Ole Miss and South Carolina in? That doesn't really feel particularly appropriate either, because again, you're dealing with a lot of unbalanced schedules. And oh, by the way, losses still have to matter. And if you're going to lose to Kentucky at home, if you're going to lose to Oklahoma, if you're going to lose to Vanderbilt, that I've yet to hear a compelling argument for why, in such a small sample size, we're supposed to only focus on the wins and not focus at all on the losses. Why that hasn't been brought up as a point of conversation on ESPN, I think we can kind of fill in those gaps a little bit. But that's really ultimately why I find so much of the way ESPN framed their coverage today disappointing, because I think it sows these seeds of division when most of the problems are simply mathematical. Like, you just simply can't play enough games to get a clear sense. And strength of schedule by itself, as we know, is a crappy metric to be judging teams on.
Yeah. I would also say, Indiana is a case that I think people need to be wary of, in that, had they lost that Michigan game, let's just say they lose that game, or, maybe it really is just that Michigan game. If they lose that Michigan game, and, that was a tight game, 2 or 3 plays go differently, they lose it, they're out. Like, no question in my mind, they don't make this college football playoff. But this is a real hypothetical. You could look at those metrics and judge them against some of the other teams near the bottom. And it's like, how are we that much different than SMU with 2 losses where SMU is now? But we all know that we wouldn't have made it just because we're not the name brand of a Notre Dame and a Penn State. And part of the reason those teams were always ahead of us is they just started ahead of us. And it's kind of just inertia to where you stay. But, if you're not a name brand, if you're Rutgers or you're Maryland, or you're, some degree, Northwestern or Illinois, you got to look at Indiana and be like, damn, they had to thread the needle to get there. And one little misstep and they wouldn't have made it. Now, okay, that, we are trying to get a champion here, but you have other teams that had multiple missteps, like Alabama and even Georgia, and they get there. How is this if, there's more teams that are not name brands in the SEC and the Big Ten than are teams that are. And so if you're any of those bottom tier teams, you look at Indiana and it's like, dude, I would love to get to the college football playoff if I'm Illinois or Northwestern. And like, I'd love to be able to do it without having to have basically a completely perfect season. Because with 12 teams, you can't assume everyone's perfect. So I just think, I think that's also why you need to, they will expand it. They're going to. There's also just too much money involved. But, Indiana is also, even though they made it, they are kind of a scary story to some of those other teams, because if you're any of those low-level teams, it's like, damn, we've got to basically pitch a shutout to get there, when all the other name team, if Indiana had lost to Northern Illinois at home and went undefeated the rest of the year and take Ohio State out, they're not in
conversation here, probably. Well, I don't know.
That loss sucks.
I don't know if I totally agree with that. If they had beaten Ohio State at Ohio State,
yes, you're right. That's where it's not quite apples to apples.
But look, there's no question, in an expanded environment in college football where you have far too many teams packed into far too large a conferences, and you can't guarantee the best, or do you want the best teams to play the best teams? Like, this is the thing. Like, these SEC schools don't actually want to play good teams all the time. They claim that they do, but I mean, what was the last time Vanderbilt beat Alabama? Was like 1985 or something like that. It was some ridiculous thing. And this has been one of the arguments that we used to make about IU football, when people would say, oh, you're going to get kicked out of the big landscape of college football. And it's like, no, because if you only have the top 20 teams, guess what? There's some really high level brands that suddenly are going like 2-10 every year. That's not going to happen.
He's not signing up for that. James Franklin and Penn State. They're like, yeah, we don't want to play top 10 teams every week. No.
At all possible? Yes. So, what do you think about the rest of the draw? We've obviously focused on Indiana a lot here, but it's an interesting set of first round matchups. As you go down the list, you've got, let's start with the 5-12. Texas yesterday, their offense just didn't look great. They struggled in the passing game. Georgia's defense is pretty good, but I was surprised to a little degree that they only dropped to 5th. They are playing Clemson, who looked pretty good for most of that game versus SMU, but then SMU came back, tied it up. Clemson had to hit that field goal at the end. Clemson has lost to South Carolina. They've lost to Georgia. How do they fare against Texas is going to be a really interesting question mark, because even though they have to go to Austin, I don't know that for sure that's a game that you would just automatically put in Texas's win column, given that Texas's best wins on the season are Texas A&M and Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this with the entire playoff seeding. Like, the other thing that I would love to see changed moving forward. Again, we've been here for 12 seconds. We're already rearranging the house. The automatic bids for the 4 teams, and then the 5th one getting in, just it doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. Like, Arizona State gets a bye.
Right.
Just seems kind of wild. They need to adjust that. I think that needs to be adjusted relatively quickly. I had kind of heard that was part of the problem, is they all got together to figure this out, and the only things they could agree on is that Notre Dame could be in and the 5 conference champions get in. It's like everything else was like, we'll figure that out later, and then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, the show's in 10 minutes. Like,
right.
All right, let's come up with the playoff setup. It definitely does feel like Penn State got one of the better draws out there, just based on the teams and the names. Having SMU at home, and then going to playing Boise State in a bowl game. It feels like they have a pretty good draw there. And it does feel like Oregon kind of doesn't fully get rewarded as the number 1 seed. I mean, playing either Ohio State again or Tennessee, that's a tough second round matchup.
Right.
So I look at that, I honestly look at our draw, and again, I think, all of these teams are good. I'm not trying to, degrade anybody, but it is an Indiana podcast. I think we had, of all the teams available, that's the best road game I'd like to play. And then I don't think Georgia's going to be easy, but if, their quarterback is hurt, we're not sure what that's going to look like. And if you can get by Georgia, it does feel like, of Penn State, Boise State, SMU, I would like our chances on a neutral site against those teams versus had that, trio been Oregon, Ohio State, and Tennessee. Like, I'd much rather play the triumvirate that we'd play in the semifinals if we get there than, where we'd be on the top side of the bracket. So, it's funny being in this so much, even as they're releasing the bracket, I'm like trying to remember, okay, like there's got to be a bye there. Like, I'm like, I can't even put this into my mind. I'm just going to wait for them to show it to me, because it's so weird where people get slotted. But I think for us, it's as good a bracket. You're going to have to go through somebody good at some point. And I do think of all the teams, Oregon is the one that frightens me the most. So I like them on the other side. And I think they have as you look at it, just kind of what you see, they seem to have a really hard road to get there. Whereas it does look like Penn State's got a pretty easy path to the semifinals if they get there.
Well, you never know with these things. I mean, SMU played, I think, they played at a level that was surprising to a lot of people against Clemson in the second half, especially. So that's another one of those situations where I would expect Penn State to win that game, but I wouldn't be shocked if SMU gave them a game, because SMU has shown they can score. However, I do think if you're Penn State, you're much happier playing against SMU in that game than against Alabama, which would have been the other option. And so, and I agree. I mean, Boise's going to be a fascinating one. I haven't seen if they've yet announced where all those games are going, because
Oregon's at the
Rose Bowl, right?
Yeah, we'd be Sugar Bowl. So the other two are what, like?
Well, I'm assuming, and this may be where, because Boise is the 3, they may end up getting the Fiesta Bowl, which would move Arizona State in the 4 to the Peach Bowl, which, I mean, certainly that's why I'm going to be curious about that, because I'm sure the committee would rather have Arizona State. If someone in the comments has seen where that's going, let me know. I've been looking around while we've been podcasting, but I haven't seen anything. Let's talk about some of the other games, though.
Yeah.
So you go to the 8-9, the one we haven't talked about yet. Ohio State and Tennessee. I think Ohio State's got to be
the angst level at that game has to be the highest. Like, Tennessee gets up to a 10-0 lead.
Yeah.
they might just fire Ryan Day on the spot.
Brian saying that Boise is the Fiesta and ASU is the Peach Bowl. So that's tough luck for Arizona State, and probably good luck for whoever they're playing in the second round, whether it is Texas or whether it's Clemson.
Clemson, because Peach Bowl is like Atlanta, right?
Peach Bowl is definitely Atlanta. So
like a home game for Clemson, yeah.
It's going to be fascinating. But no, to go back to what you said,
Ohio State fans at home.
Yeah, to go back to what you said, like Texas or excuse me, Ohio State and Tennessee. This is a matchup that is, I think, a really interesting one from a variety of perspectives. Not the least of which is what you just were talking about, which is that you've got, an Ohio State fan base that is very disgruntled and is not happy with Ryan Day, is not happy with their overall situation, is really, really pissed that they're essentially in a position where they're like
or they have to play a home game in the first round.
You've got Ohio State fans who have said, and pundits too, who have said in all seriousness,
he's got to win a title to keep his job. Yeah.
No, we don't want him to win a title because we want him to get fired. Like that's where the discourse has gone over the last week in Ohio State land, which is bonkers. But that's a weird environment for a Tennessee team to be coming into. And you also have to keep in mind, like, we've been to a bowl game with Tennessee recently. We know how those fans operate. I don't know that there's a more oil and water mixture that you could get in the first round of the playoff than Tennessee fans driving up I-75 to I-71 and taking their spots in Columbus. That's going to be a really fascinating thing to watch. And I mean, Tennessee on the season, we've talked about them a bit. If you look at the rankings of, in terms of FPI and how they square overall, Ohio State is third in the country in FPI. Tennessee is seventh in the country in FPI. So they're relatively similar to each other. Tennessee's offense is kind of suspect, but their defense is awesome. Ohio State, they're pretty good across the board, but they just had trouble against a worse defense against Michigan, being able to move the ball. So I am really, really fascinated to see how that matchup goes and what the atmosphere will be like in that stadium.
Oh, I mean, I would love to see nothing more than like a 3rd and 2 and Ohio State not get it and then punt and just the whole crowd start booing their own team. I mean, it could almost become a home game for Tennessee if they get enough of a momentum going. I mean, that is a very, very unhappy fan base who I love the idea of them being pissed they're here. Like that the indignity they have to play this. I look at that one. I also, it's really cool to see SMU back in the mix. I was with some friends last night, and it's also funny how people are just like, oh, I didn't know SMU used to be good, right? It's like, yeah, like they had Eric Dickerson, like they were really good, like, and they got a death penalty, like, oh, like they got sanctions.
Well,
like, oh no, like they weren't allowed to play football for like 2 years. Like,
but it is also interesting. I mean, if you think about the SMU, they were and if you haven't watched Pony Excess, you should definitely watch it. Great documentary. But I think it is important to keep in mind that while SMU was certainly a very good team, like they never quite got to the upper echelon of college football during that time in the 80s. And that was why they ended up on the death penalty in the first place, was how much money they were spending behind the scenes to try to get there. I mean, you go back and, they had 3 bowl games in a row. The best bowl game they ever went to during that stretch, 82, 83, 84, was the Cotton Bowl. And, they the other 2 years, they were in the Sun Bowl, they were in the Aloha Bowl, they went to a Holiday Bowl in 1980. So it's like they're back, but they weren't really, this is much like Indiana, this is the farthest that they've ever been in the overall college football setup. And I do think that is really cool. It's a neat setup all together. And it's what, again, irritates me about ESPN is this is what should be celebrated. You have the losingest FBS power conference program in the country going to the playoff. You have a team that was literally given the death penalty in the playoff. Like, these are things that should be celebrated. You have Boise State in the playoff. That's amazing. And instead, we're complaining that a 3-loss Alabama team that lost to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma didn't get in, or we're complaining that South Carolina didn't get in. It's like, guys, this is how you kill a sport, by focusing on the wrong things.
Well, no, you're so right. And you think about like when the Cubs won the World Series, it was just all talk of, oh my God, this team sucks since 1908, like just hasn't had success. It is funny as you say that. I think you've not seen nationally the story of like, man, it's insane that Indiana's here. Like, this is the losingest program in college football. They made this turnaround. This is the ultimate underdog story. You saw a little bit before the Ohio State game. They had, a little bit of the Hoosiers. They did an intro with the Hoosiers thing, but it's like, this is, this is the ultimate underdog story. Like there is not a worse team in college football who's made a faster turnaround. And the idea that it's really not been talked about, that the narrative has been, why the hell can't we get them out of here? Like, let's get one of the teams that we know. Like, I want one of the big brands. It's wild. And you're right about Boise State. There's a narrative of Boise State. They touched on it for a second on the show today, but like, this is a program that was like, all right, we're going to play all the big boys. We're going to fight our way to a college, a New Year's Day Six Bowl. We're going to win that. We're going to keep fighting, and we're going to get here. And there's also the narrative too with SMU that, it's funny. I talk to friends and they don't fully know. It's like SMU, you talk about an ultimate gamble. They're just like, hey, we'll take no in this world of TV money and everybody needs to be in a conference with money. They're just like, hey, we'll sit at the big kids table. We'll take no money for 10 years. And we'll just have our boosters. They'll fill the spot that Fox and ABC fills for everybody else. We'll just have the boosters write $100 million check and let's do it.
Yep.
Which is like, hey, I'll take this job and I'll be an intern. Like, they're basically a college football intern, and they got to this level. Those are all amazing stories. But you're right. As you said, it's all about how dare we leave Alabama out of this? Like, how is this the first time we have it and Alabama's not there? Just back to the Indiana piece. I just love looking at this bracket.
Yep.
Because it's so small and there's so few teams and we're on it.
Yes.
Like, that's the great thing. It's not a big bracket and we're there.
Yes. Yeah, it's a neat, I know. I'm still having trouble processing all of this, Scott. I got to be honest. It is amazing that all of this has come together the way that it has. And it is a really, really cool thing for Indiana athletics, for Indiana University, and certainly for Indiana football, and something that's liable to have amazing benefits for years to come.
I mean, for a program that prides itself on basketball, and I'm thinking of this, I did not think of this before the show, but is this going to be the most significant game in IU athletics since the Final Four game against Maryland in 2001? Or was it maybe we're the one seed playing Syracuse in the round of 32?
That's probably it. That's probably the answer. What you just said is the Syracuse game, because that was a really important game. I mean, if Indiana wins that game in basketball, it is for football. It is.
Yeah, it is.
It's just, and it's like it's since the Rose Bowl game, really, right. And even that this is one of those things where that game was certainly incredibly important, but like for the future, for the financial future of the university and the football program and everything, this one takes on even more added importance. And so it's fascinating to think about that. Like, we're most of the time when we talk about these things historically, they happened years ago. We're not living in the future, or not living in the historical moment. We're doing that right now. It's really nuts.
Yeah. No, I think it's probably that Syracuse game in 2013. And it's, that also doesn't feel that far ago, but we're talking 11 years, but you could really make the case it's since, that national championship game, or maybe the Final Four game against Oklahoma, the round before. Because this is it's different for that Indiana basketball team because they were ranked number one and you were kind of looking at a Final Four bid. But this is more akin to already a Sweet 16 game, and it's football. I don't know. It's definitely up there, and that's again saying a lot that this is the biggest, one of the two biggest games in this century for Indiana athletics.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be amazing to watch all of this play out, and we're going to have a lot more to talk about throughout the course of the upcoming week. Indiana in the playoff and playing Notre Dame. So we'll have our normal group. We'll have Bison Chat back this week. We'll talk about it there. We'll have Taylor Lehman on a couple of times, certainly. We're going to do a recap at some point on what's happened with recruiting and what we're looking at in the portal. There's so much to go and talk through with all of this, and we're looking forward to speaking with you all about it over the course of the next 12 days. So, Scott, any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
We made it. We are in the fever dream. I mean, this is bananas, dude. You and I have been doing this podcast since 2008. We kind of really started hitting football in like 09 and 10. I will remember this forever. When I moved back to Indiana like a year or two ahead of you, and I got season tickets for football. Not to throw you under the bus here, but I do remember your comment. I was like, hey, man, I love going to football games. I like college football. Like, it's fun. I'm getting tickets. And you're like, why? Like, well, because I like the environment. You're like, well, if you like college football, then go to a place that they actually play college football. Like, go to but you know, this is all change. And what is so cool is this, we could be proven wrong. I don't think that getting to the college football playoff year in, year out is the goal at Indiana. But the success that we're having, it does feel like this is replicatable. And it feels like this time we have an infrastructure in place that, to me, the goal is we've pulled ourselves out of that, bottom ooze that we continue to fall into. And maybe we are now on enough solid footing of like 5 wins where we can take steps up. Whereas it always felt like before we were in the ooze trying just to step up to that next level. It does feel like, and to me, that is, all of this is awesome. And what happens from here is just, this is all gravy train from here on out. But to me, the most important part of this season is it does feel like we have taken a step up and we've cemented ourselves, and like we are mid-level Big Ten. We can work our way to mid-upper tier of Big Ten. I could be proven wrong, but I don't feel that way. It does feel like the next 5 or 6 years we're going to have a good run. Doesn't mean we'll get back in the college football playoff, but at Indiana, that's not what the goal is. The goal is just being in bowl games, having winning seasons, and when things line up correctly, having a season like this being possible.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. And, I'll just say for myself, this has been a fascinating journey, not just this year, but for the decades that you and I have been watching IU football. We've had so many people reach out and express their joy, not just at what IU football has been doing, but at being able to kind of live through this and with you and me being able to have the conversations and meet people out. It's been a lot of fun. And I'm thrilled that Indiana is in the college football playoff, that this particular matchup is going to be one that we're going to remember for the rest of our lives, one way or another.
Yeah.
And it's an amazing continuation of what has been, for my money, one of the best stories in, really maybe the history of college football. To go from as bad as Indiana was and as lost as the program was a little over a year ago to being in the college football playoff, not as the last team in, right, playing against the Notre Dame team that has always been the gold standard for college football in the state of Indiana, and really most of the Midwest. That is a cool, awesome place to be. And I'm just really excited that that's where Indiana's at right now with things. And we got a lot more to talk about with it throughout the course of the week, and then we will do that. So anyway, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Again, reminder, folks, Home Field Apparel just dropped an entire IU football collection. Go check it out. Commemorating IU in the college football playoff. You'll want to get some of that merch before it's gone. So grab that. And we will be back later on in the week. We will have Bison Chat, I think, on Tuesday, but we'll double check and let you know. Check us on X, and we'll be back and chatting with you then. Joe Cronin and Emily Fox joining me on that show. For Scott, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We will catch you folks on the flip side. And again, Indiana in the college football playoff is the 10 seed, taking on the Notre Dame Fighting Irish Friday, December 20th at 8 p.m. on ABC. Folks, stay never daunted. Bring back the Bison. Hoosiers in the college football playoff. So long, everybody. Bye, YouTube.